A cardinal error is to try to expand a culture linearly, like at the same level. Language is a good example. So a cardinal error is to say, we need everybody to speak English or Chinese, right? But you pick a language. And so, of course, what ends up happening is you end up with an imperial mode, right? Your mind has to be operating this particular culture, this language. And now we're competing for minds. And maybe you might speak 3 languages, but at the end of the day, there's sort of like a finite, there's a rivalrous game for minds in culture space. If you run it at the meta protocol, what happens is that as long as there's a way for us to establish, and languages is there, translatability, communication can occur. And that communication can occur within certain boundary conditions, i.e. that it's not so expensive that it's not really communication, right? The entropy is low enough. Then you get around the rivalrous dynamic. It's like, okay, great. You can have an arbitrarily large number of cultures. Right. Everybody can kind of, and if I want to create my own, I can create my own. As long as it's compatible with the meta protocol, I got a lot of room to maneuver. Right. And the meta protocol, which is funny about it, is the meta protocol is almost geometric. What I mean by that is you're always going to want to design your culture using the meta protocol because it's just the best way to design a culture. Right? If you design a culture outside of the boundary of the meta protocol, it's not like, how do I say this? It's like saying, okay, I'm going to design a body, but I'm going to design a body that can't digest or that dies within 3 days. You're like, that's kind of a shitty body. You could do it. What's the point of that? Like, no. Here's a series of basic rules that make a body work. And, your body can be 6'4", it can be 5'8", your skin color can vary in these directions, your eyes, like there's a whole bunch of variation on the morphology of phylogenetics. But and by the way, this actually wide varies, but a body without a heart is kind of a non-starter. Like that's just a bad idea. So it's kind of like that. Like the meta protocols for any viable culture that plugs into this environment is like a body. And so you've got lots of variations. And in some sense, there's now no competition because you're really just looking at cool explorations of what the possibility space is inside the meta protocol, which could potentially be enormous, like much larger than our current space of cultures, but they're all viable. Yeah. And part of viability is they're all interoperable.
Yeah. Yeah. And they can all interconnect and potentially speak that same language.
Right.
On a completely different new paradigm, ideally, which doesn't lead to all the current issues that we face that could potentially blow us all up, right? With the technology coming up and
yeah, that's really interesting. I just had some insights on how to articulate that clearly. Okay, so please continue.
Yeah,
because that's like, sorry, like I think the constraints are if you use the metaphor of speciation at the body level, there's some value there. The point of speciation, or the way that we have come to define speciation, is precisely lack of compatibility at the genotype level. And so if I have 2 phenotypes that actually, they may be bizarrely compatible, like they can actually mate at in terms of physicality, but they're not compatible at the genetic level, then I don't actually, I have now 2 species. And what happens, of course, is that they stop mating and they begin to speciate, they begin to differentiate.
Exactly.
And so some of the meta questions are like, whoa, okay, what are the constraints? And we're finding, we're if I think about it in terms of Peter Lindbergh's, Culture War 2.0.
Right.
When 2 cultures are in a circumstance where the only way they can be in relationship with each other is in fact violence.
Exactly.
Then they're effectively engaging in a speciation event. Right? They're mutually incompatible and they're engaged in per se rivalrous competition. So it's interesting to say, okay, the meta protocol effectively is the inverse of that. What's a mechanism? What are the characteristics that your culture must maintain at all times to ensure that there's always a non-violent way of being in relationship with any other culture? Sorry, so please continue.
No, I mean, sorry. What I got from there is, how you talked about the level of change needs to be on we create a new DNA, RNA thing that now opens up whole new pathway. That's what I'm hearing, right? Like the meta protocol ends up being we have to figure out what that DNA that allows for all these potential new cultures to come and rise that are on a different operating system than what we currently have.
Yeah, and what's interesting is that it's I had this insight yesterday actually. There will be a lot of resonance with in some sense like the highest tone of almost all existing cultures. There's a if you use the metaphor of like the emergence of the neuron, of neurology, like okay, there's like the proto neuron, like the proto retinal, the proto photosensitive cell. There's a movement where there's a cell that has a certain sensitivity to photon, but it's kind of haphazard. It's sort of not useful enough to really build stuff. You can't build eyeballs with it, right? It's just not high fidelity enough. It's not consistent enough. It's not repeatable enough. But you know, if you kind of look at there's like a vector that is pointing towards this place, this location. It's like, oh, okay, now that is the thing, right? And if I see the tree, like the series of evolutionary stages, I can actually see where they are on the arrow, and the ones that are closest to the final to the actual point where like, oh, I've got a retinal cell, like a photo cell or a photosensitive cell, like the ones that are just prior to that. I'm anthropomorphizing, but the ones that are just prior to that, I'd be like, yes, that. That's what I was trying to get to. And even though they may all be variations, there's the commonality is that they're all going to point at that, right? So there's like the highest tone, the highest yearning, the thing that has been the most noble or valorous aspect of many, many different cultures is the point. I guess that's the vector. We can kind of suss out that vector and say, oh, okay, that's the noble thing that's been trying to arise in culture. We can now kind of point at it, and now many, many different cultures will be able to look at this new thing and say, oh yeah, cool. That's it. That's kind of reified the good part, and like an alchemical essence. We captured the part that we've been trying to get to. The essence was trying to express itself, and have been able to get rid of the stuff that was, legacy that needs to go away. The Michelangelo move.
The Michelangelo move.